Hello, my name is Douglas Bouchong. I'm a project manager and instructional designer, and this is the postmortem turning hindsight into foresight. So when I started my current position, I was assigned a few small projects to help me get acclimated to my team. And I made a commitment at that time to conduct a postmortem on every project to help me learn and to help us make sure we're improving our projects from project to project. So if you're watching this, I'm assuming you probably understand what a postmortem is, but I just want to make sure that we're working from the same operative definition. So looking at the definition from the most definitive source of information on the internet, Wikipedia, we see a project postmortem is a process usually performed at the conclusion of a project to determine and analyze the elements of the project that were successful or unsuccessful. And the results that come out of the postmortem are called the lessons learned. Another way of looking at this is a postmortem will help us to promote the recurrence of desirable outcomes or preclude the recurrence of undesirable outcomes. So what happened here? At the end of each project, I brought my project team together and I typed and listened as they told me what went well and what didn't go well on the project. Now you'll see here that there are more instances of what went poorly, and that's intentional. That's generally what happens. On a few of my postmortems, there were instances where team members would say, we've discussed this before, and this was similar to something that happened on another project. So I asked them to elaborate on that, and I came away with a list of projects that apparently had the same problems as some of my projects. I went to our shared drive and did a search for the words lessons learned and postmortem, and I found several files with lessons learned notes. So I was fortunate in that I had the history, but I didn't have an easily accessible place to pull them together and see what was actually learned from them. I noticed three problems as I went through the lessons learned. First, I noticed that they seemed inconsistent in the questions that were being asked and the way that the notes were being taken, and many of the notes only included the final comments on issues rather than the entire discussion on the issue. And so this caused us to have a lot of breadth in the documentation, but very little depth. The lessons learned notes were also scattered and spread throughout the shared space, and none of them appeared to be consolidated. So this made them inaccessible, and any kind of review of the lessons learned was really impractical, especially if you're trying to do the review at the start of the project. And that brings us to the third issue. No process was put in place to apply them to future projects, so I couldn't see where they were being applied. And this last one was the consequence of the inaccessibility. So with that in mind, what I want to talk about today is how to address these three issues. So the objectives today are to discuss conducting a project postmortem, documenting the lessons learned, and then applying those lessons learned to future projects. So you've completed the project, and now it's time to conduct your postmortem. In the spirit of Simon Sinek starting with why, I want to take a moment to discuss why we conduct the postmortem and why we gather the lessons learned. This book, Waltzing with Bears by DeMarco and Lister, is a book about risks, and it has an excellent quote. Today's problems are tomorrow's risks. And this probably feels backwards. We tend to want to say yesterday's risks are today's problems, or today's risks are tomorrow's problems. But that's an insular view. That's a view of the risk and problems within the context of a project. But when you're looking at an entire portfolio of projects, you want to be able to translate from one project to the next to the next. That's where you have to look at the problems of today as your lens into tomorrow's risks. Now, we're going to come back to this idea later on when we talk about applying the lessons learned from the postmortem. So how do you conduct the postmortem? Ultimately, you're going to need to come up with a way to get honest feedback from your team. Now, there are multiple ways of doing this. One that I would recommend is some variation of de Bono's 6 thinking caps. So Edward de Bono developed the 6 thinking hats as a tool to enhance group discussions and to get the members of the discussion thinking in a cohesive way. So as we look at these questions, think about a project that you may have just completed or a project that you're currently working on. So once you've got that, here are some questions to ask. Look at the yellow hat. What went well on that project? So for the things that went well, you probably have some information on what was done that made those things go well. Good. Take the time to document the rationale behind those good decisions. Okay? Then think about what could improve or what went poorly. So the black hat, if the yellow hat is about positives, the black hat is about negatives. So the red hat is about feelings. How did you feel through the project? So what occurred in the project to foster goodwill and to support the team? This is important because if we complete projects on time but everybody feels awful, it may be great for that one project. But if you're trying to manage a portfolio of projects over the course of years, it will eat into the effectiveness of your future projects. The white hat is about data. So what data or information could have helped on the projects? And in some ways, you should let this speak to the yellow and black hats. So if something went well, was there a piece of information that made it go well? If something didn't go well, what information could have made it go better? And the green hat is about creativity. So what suggestions do you have to make the projects run more smoothly? And note that you're going to have your ideas, but you should focus on the ideas presented by the team as the project manager. At this point, I would stress a very yes and approach. If you're familiar with improv, one of the rules of improv is if somebody presents something, you say yes and you take that idea and really pull on it. Take the same approach when you're looking at the green hat. So do everything you can to elicit the ideas from the team and really generate that creativity. And there's kind of a bonus question there. You could say, if we were to do it again with perfect hindsight, what would we do differently? Now, you may have noticed that Demano had 6 thinking hats and I only have 5 here. The reason is because the last hat is about the process. So this hat's very meta. It's about defining the process that you're going to use for the postmortem. You may decide that you want to work with the team to discuss the blue hat, or you may not. That's up to you. But you want to define the postmortem goals, summarize the project, and then define the structure and the process. So who should be involved? I've heard arguments about who you may want to include in your postmortem. Some might say that you only want to include those who will benefit from the postmortem. I'm inclined to say that you want to include those who will bring benefit to the postmortem. So the postmortem should include the project manager. You should be the one driving this process. It should also include the project team members. So depending on the size of your project, you may want to gather survey data from the team members and have your actual meeting include a smaller core team. But don't leave the project team members out. Give them the opportunity to speak and to provide their feedback. It may also include the project sponsor. And on some larger projects, there may be issues with having the sponsor in the postmortem, especially if the team members report to the sponsor. That could create a space where people are afraid to speak. But if that's the case, then you may need to do multiple sessions, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. You should also include key stakeholders, including customers. So think about feedback that you get from this project in the same way if you were making a game, the feedback you would get from playtesters, or if you're developing an instructional design, a course in an instructional design project, the feedback you would get from the learners. You want to include their perspective on it because that will help you to improve on future iterations. So how should the data be gathered? There are a few different ways that you can gather data for your postmortem. One is a face-to-face meeting, so a round table. This can be very useful because it's great for small groups. Because it allows people to speak up and get their ideas out. And you can also have deeper discussions on specific issues as people are able to kind of riff off of each other. Now, there are some cons to this. One is a dominant talker can monopolize the meeting. And depending on the project, it could get contentious. If a project didn't go well, it's very easy to fall into a kind of a blame game. You can also use a facilitated workshop. Now I have little sticky notes here to denote the facilitated workshop, but the idea is that you get people together, and when you talk about each of the concepts like the yellow hat, the black hat, what went well, you ask people to write down what they felt went well, what didn't go well. It has a few benefits. One is it's a good way to manage very large groups. It's useful for managing postmortems that may get contentious, and another benefit is nobody gets drowned out. Everybody's getting a chance to write their information down and put it up. Another benefit is it allows you to create affinity diagrams by taking the feedback from the groups and putting them together to show, oh, everybody felt that this thing worked well. Everybody felt this other thing worked poorly. And it allows you to very quickly define the common themes of the project. Now, one con is it takes more time to analyze this. So if you've got 100 sticky notes, 200 sticky notes, and you need to arrange them, that can take time. Another con is the responses aren't necessarily going to be as deep as what you would get out of a roundtable. And another is this can be expensive if you're using an independent facilitator. So another thing you can consider is surveys. Surveys allow you to create quantifiable metrics on your feedback. They allow time for thought for the responses. So if you put a survey out and you say you have a week to provide your feedback, you can give people more time to think. And some people are better off the cuff. Some people are better at thinking about their answer and being very precise in their wording. Another benefit of surveys is nobody gets drowned out. Everybody has the opportunity to respond. And when you have anonymity, people don't necessarily have to be afraid of the responses that they give. A con of the survey is it doesn't inherently allow you to get a Q&A or to address follow-up questions, and it can take more time to develop and review. So a real sweet spot might be to mix and match, and this is only if you have the time and the resources to do it. So if you can send the survey out on the front end and throughout the life of the project, get everyone's feedback, and then use that feedback to guide the discussion, you may get a more engaged group. This can be especially useful if you expect the postmortem to get contentious, as it allows for thoughtful discussion of the feedback rather than jumping straight into a blame game. So here's an example of a way that a survey can lead to quantifiable feedback. So what we did here was we gave areas of the core or of the project: internal communication, external communications, the approval process, the schedule and timing, sponsorship, and so on. We asked people to provide feedback on which of these areas worked well. That's what you see when you see the green bar at the top. Those were all the instances where people on the project felt that these areas worked well. Then we asked, which areas do you think needed improvement? And then the red bars at the bottom below the 0 show the areas of the project that need improvement. So generally, the respondents felt that internal communications and sponsorship and the decision log and the project documents and the approval process generally worked well. Where the places that they felt needed the most improvement was around the schedule, the project schedule, and the requirements gathering process early in the project. We then pulled this information into the discussion. So we projected this information, this bar chart, and explained it to the group during the actual sit-down roundtable portion of the postmortem. And it allowed people to see what the general feelings were. And then we could focus on things like, what about the schedule and timing didn't go well? What about the requirements gathering didn't go well? So now we're getting into problem solving rather than blaming of people. So again, looking at the data from another perspective, this is the survey that we provided for the Red Hat. So we wanted to get an idea of how people felt through the project. So in order to do this, we chose 7 words. We chose 3 positive words, such as satisfied or successful, 3 negative words, such as ignored or frustrated, and 1 neutral word. And we asked people to identify how they felt throughout the project at each phase. So we had the initiation phase, where we were just getting started developing the charter. We had the early, middle, and late planning phases, and the late planning phase ended with the lead up to go live. We had the implementation, and we had the closure. And what we found here was generally people chose the positive words at the early and the implementation phase, and the neutral word was just okay. And the places where there was the most negative emotion was at the initiation, and that's where things are very ambiguous, and in the lead up to the implementation. And then in the feedback we received on the closure, there were some loose ends that needed to be addressed. So we asked them to provide the word that described how they felt, and then we left an open-ended space for them to add comments and reflect it. We reflected this back to the team during the postmortem session. So for large projects, you may have to have multiple postmortems, and this is especially true if there's a potential for a contentious meeting, or if there's a concern about the project team and the project sponsor, say, being in the same session. It could be that the sponsor needs to hear it from the team, but that's something that you as the project manager will need to assess about your organization. So when it comes to capturing the lessons learned, here are a few key points that I think may help you. The first is have an agenda, and I cannot stress this enough. Postmortems can devolve into chaos if you don't have an agenda and you're not holding the group to that agenda. The second is to take ownership, and I show this as extending an olive branch. So you remember earlier, I was talking about ways that you can get things out of the blame space and get it onto what could have been done to make an improvement. As the project manager, you're the owner of the project. So if something wasn't done right, it is on you. And that might be uncomfortable for other people to say, and it may be uncomfortable for you to hear if it's something directly related to you. So a good way to get the discussion going is to point out something that you, the project manager, could have improved upon and describe it to the group. Then when they see that you're taking ownership of that, it'll open up discussion for them to provide their feedback as well. So generally, you should seek elaboration and avoid yes or no questions. So if somebody points out an issue, a yes or no question is a great way to make them feel defensive. So if instead of asking the yes or no question, you seek elaboration by asking an open-ended question, you'll keep the room calm. So if someone says the project was awful, ask what they felt was problematic and then sit there and listen and let the silence pull out the answers. The next thing is listen to the feedback. So think about the feedback that you get from this project in the same way that you think about feedback from your playtesters if you're making a game. If you're wholesale telling your playtesters that they are wrong when they give you feedback on your product, then it's likely it's not the playtesters that are wrong. The same is true for feedback from your team in the postmortem. And the last thing here is write everything down. So the goal at this point is to just get everything written down as it is said to the extent that you can. So you want to be able to incubate on what was said and reflect on the context of the discussion as you go into the next phase of this process, which is documenting your lessons learned. So now you've completed your project, you've conducted the postmortem, and you've captured your notes. Now what do you do with them? So here we're going to discuss ways to document your lessons learned. So I just want to point out here that when things are in writing, there's an air of authority and officiality to them. And this is especially true when the thing that you've identified as a lesson learned is coming from the person who was giving pushback on your risk assessment earlier on. So you want to get the lessons learned documented in a way that allows you to use that documentation in future projects. So what do you have? You start with stories. These are the issues that happened on the project, the problems that were identified. Now, the problems themselves are not the lessons learned. The problems are what led you to identify what could have been done differently. Then you get from the problems to specific lessons. And from those, once you've aggregated enough of those specific lessons, you can pull that up into a general set of lessons. So let's look at an example here. Let's say in one project, an employee says, "It took too long to get questions answered. This was compounded with Jim translating down to Tracy how to do the configuration, as she was one step and sometimes 3 steps removed from the project itself." In another project, sometimes the project manager held information very close to the vest and was actually a bottleneck in the project communications. It took us a long time to get our questions answered. Now let's look at a third project. The discussion going through the PM didn't always answer the questions that we asked or that followed. The turnaround on follow-up questions was too long. Now these pieces of feedback came from separate projects, but they have a general theme. So when you take those and pull them together, you may aggregate that up into a lesson that looks something like this. The project manager should be a focal point, not a funnel for communications. While the communication plan for the project should be respected, they should not create unnecessary bottlenecks or extra steps in technical communications. The same is true for the analysts, the vendors, etc. Generally, if anyone on the project finds themselves in the middle of a string of communications, we should strive to get the 2 people that need to talk introduced so that they can address the questions directly. Now, this may seem like an obvious lesson learned, but I can tell you that it's not obvious in an organization that has a very deeply entrenched hierarchical structure. If it's obvious in your organization, great. You're going to have lessons learned that never occurred to me. But one benefit of gathering the lessons learned in this way is that it gets these types of issues into writing. And it allows you to break through those hierarchies and get your projects done more efficiently. So there's a general structure that you can have for your lessons learned. They don't need to be in this order, but it's a good idea to have these components. And this is a condition where the lesson learned is applicable, a description of how that condition should be managed, and then additional information or consequences. And this is kind of optional. And here are a few examples. What is our condition? If an analyst has a significant experience with a given subject matter expert, there's your condition. How are you going to manage that? Either 1, that analyst should be assigned to the project as the point of contact, or 2, clear communications and reminders should be sent to the SME to ensure that the questions are routed through the assigned analyst and not the separate analyst with the prior relationship. Now, here was an example that came from a set of projects where we had an analyst who had previously worked with the SME. Now, that analyst was doing other work when the time for that SME's project to come up, when the time came for that SME's project to come up. So a different analyst was assigned, but the SME kept going back to the original analyst. Here, we've codified why this could be problematic, and we can keep reinforcing with the SME, this is going to lead to problems if we continue this behavior. So here's another example. For new projects with a broad audience across several entities, so there's our condition. And by entities, we're talking about separate sub-organizations within the greater organization. There's an elevated risk of either A, portions of the audience not having active accounts, or B, populations having accounts being captured in the audience, but not meeting the true scope of the project. A good indicator of this is an audience or scope definition that includes words like everyone, or all employees, or anyone with. So when this happens, additional time needs to be built into the project schedule to review any audiences that meet these criteria, and the risk of these two errors happening should be identified in the project risks. Now there's a mouthful there, but what we're talking about here is in our organization, we often have to translate ambiguous requirements into data so that training can be assigned. What this is calling out is a space where there's elevated risk. And this is, I'm kind of hinting at where we're going to go with all of this documentation when we're done. So a guilty pleasure of mine is in watching foreign parliaments. This gives an interesting view of how political stances are viewed around the world. One that I followed for the past 4 years is the New Zealand Parliament, especially during question time, and that's who you see here. They do a good job of staying civil while maintaining a robust debating chamber. Now, the House is governed by several documents, but two of them are the standing orders and the Speaker's rulings. The Speaker's rulings are a collection of rulings that previous speakers since 1867 have made around the interpretations of standing orders and other rules of the House. So after a while, I'd noticed that when some members of Parliament disagreed with the Speaker, they would call out a previous Speaker's ruling, to which the Speaker would often cite another ruling that justified the ruling that they made. And when this would happen, in order to know what they were talking about, I would have to pause the video and look up the Speaker's rulings and then play it back again and find out the resolution. So the Speaker's rulings are structured into categories based on the subjects of the ruling. They include the meat of the ruling, and below them they include the Speaker who made that ruling or who made a similar ruling reinforcing that ruling. So essentially they have a pivot table of the Speaker's rulings. So it was while I was looking through this and working out my own problem of sorting out the postmortems that I realized what I could do. So my general process for developing the lessons learned log is similar. I take the text of the lessons learned, and below them I identify the specific projects that either identified that lesson learned or that reinforced that lessons learned from project to project. Now, there are several ways that this can be documented, and it'll depend on the knowledge and preferred tools of your team. The simplest method would be, and this would be the most manual method, would be to create a Word document at a shared location and pull them all together. This approach will require you to go back and reread the lessons learned after every session, but it really will embed them into your brain. And as the project manager, you need to be able to call that information up quickly. You could also put them into an Excel spreadsheet, and that allows you to pivot around the categories and pivot around the lessons learned. And this can be a useful tool because it allows you to create additional data fields later that may help you to recognize patterns that may not be obvious otherwise, such as correlations between project types and specific lessons learned. You could also create an Access database or some other database to capture your lessons learned. But one thing to consider is you don't want to manage it in such a way that it's a buried project. The goal here is to consolidate the separate lessons learned into a single place and then look at it frequently. So in that sense, I'm more of an advocate of using Word because it forces you to stay in it. And this is where we talk about the black hole. We had a black hole of files that were all over the place, scattered throughout a shared drive. And you don't want to make a log that becomes a black hole that nobody goes to look at again. So you want to keep it fresh and make it usable and ensure that you're not replacing one black hole with another. So some key points when you're documenting your lessons learned. No names. Now there may be instances of names slipping into the postmortem notes, but you need to get them out by the time you get your lessons learned done. Keep the focus on the process, not the people. The second is be transparent. So if a decision you made was bad and it was called out during the meeting, be as transparent as possible about that. Let your team and all future teams know that you acknowledge the issue and you learned the lesson as the project manager. And the last point is share the results. So along those lines, a lesson that you don't share can't be learned. So you should share the results with the project team, with the sponsors, and allow them to hold you accountable in future projects. And speaking of future projects, that's where we come to the next section, which is applying the lessons learned to the project. So at this point, you've completed a project, you've conducted your postmortem, you've documented your lessons learned, and now you're ready to start your next project. So here we're going to talk about identifying project risks and applying the lessons learned to future projects. Now remember earlier we said that today's problems are tomorrow's risks. So this is the slide you saw earlier, and I want to bring it back around because this is where we begin to use the documented problems to inform our risks. So to answer this, I've made a basic diagram here. In my own organization's lessons learned log, this diagram is actually on the front cover of the document. So the basic idea is that the starting point for applying the lessons learned is where we address the risks. When a new project begins, you're going to have some kind of kickoff or project documentation. And I'm a proponent of having bookends on all of my projects, a charter at the beginning of every project and a postmortem at the end of every project. And in that charter, you're going to identify the initial risks of the project. I don't want to get too hung up on the name here, by the way. The important thing is that you have some kind of project documentation that you call the risk out. It doesn't have to be called a charter, but you need to have the risks identified. So once you've identified your risks, you have to ask yourself if the risks were mitigated or addressed. If they were managed successfully, then you take that information to the postmortem session. If they were not managed successfully, the unmitigated risks became issues. You then address those issues and resolve them and bring that information to the postmortem. Both of those things go back to updating the lessons learned log, which then feeds into the next project. So what are the things that could go wrong on a project based on your experience from the lessons learned? Basically, you want to say in your risk assessment some form of statement like this. There is a risk that some business impact will occur if some event happens or fails to happen on the project. Another way of looking at it is in past projects where some condition existed similar to this project, some condition caused some consequence. In order to prevent that consequence, the project team will, and then you define what your mitigating action is. Now, this is especially powerful when the project sponsor or owner of the process creating the risk on the previous project is involved with the current project, because they'll know what happened and they won't want it to happen again. And here's a more concrete example of a risk that I've called out on a project before. In past projects where the approval process was undefined at the start of the project, additional approvers and extra approval cycles were added that caused delays in the project. In order to prevent the delays during the content approval, the project manager will schedule all approvals in the sponsor's calendar at the start of the project. Now, in this specific instance, again, in a hierarchical organization, you may have an approver who says, I want so-and-so other person to look at it before I do my approval. It's like, okay, that's fine, but here's the date we need the approval by, and it's on your calendar. And so if there's going to be a delay, we'll need you to actively remove it from your calendar and cancel the meeting. So their action of canceling the meeting is the thing that causes the delay. It doesn't allow a passive delay to occur. So this is an example of a risk mitigation technique that came directly out of the lessons learned log, so you can justify it very well. And so some key points here. One, of course, you're going to write the risk down. Ideas have power when you put them in writing. And if you call out a process area as a risk, it makes it clear to everyone what you see. Keep in mind that it may be uncomfortable. So you may find that you're calling out a risk related to a process, and the owner of that process may provide some pushback. You have to be ready to assure them that you're not putting a pre-designation of blame on them, but you're saying that in past projects, this has led to an issue. And so in the current project, you're identifying it as a risk, not necessarily because of that individual. Now, you need to closely monitor your risk mitigation. So what are you going to do to mitigate the risks as they come up? And the last thing here, and this comes straight out of DeMarco and Lister's book, beware the can-do attitude. So if I were to give you any reason not to write your risk down, this is the one. Some organizations don't like what they consider to be negative talk. So if you're the only project manager documenting their risks, there's a good chance that you're setting yourself up. And in those organizations, the risks are still there, but it's the project manager that calls them out that's blamed when they become issues. So what I would say there is still do the risk assessment and mitigate accordingly, but just be careful and keep your resume polished. So this is the cycle that we discussed today. You complete your project. You conduct your postmortem. You document your lessons learned. And then when you're ready to start your next project, you identify the risks, complete the project, and the cycle continues. I have two books that I strongly recommend. The first is Waltzing with Bears, Managing Risk on Software Projects by DeMarco and Lister. This is an outstanding book on risk assessment. One of the things that the book talks about is a method for calculating the overall risk, particularly risk of schedules and budgets on your projects. And so if you think about if a given task on a project has an early start, an early finish date, and a late finish date, and a most likely finish date, the sum of early start date or early finish dates and late finish dates is going to be the sum of all of those early and late finish dates for the project. So as the projects get bigger and bigger, the range of risk gets greater and greater. And so they actually have a method for doing the calculation of those risks, and it's worth looking at on their website and in the text itself. The other book I want to recommend is Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. This is a great book on the nature of taking ownership of your projects and of the issues that come up. It really reinforces that you gain trust. It may not feel good in the moment when you're taking ownership of your projects, but it gains trust over time and allows you to be a more effective project manager over time. So I strongly recommend both of these. And that's the postmortem, turning hindsight into foresight. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below, and I'm happy to discuss this or other project management or instructional design topics at any time. Thank you and have a great day.